The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long amber shadows over the quiet coastal town of Seabrook. Children laughed as they kicked a soccer ball across the sandy park, the salty breeze tugging at their hair. On a weathered bench near the water, an old man sat quietly, his hands resting on a polished wooden cane. His posture was rigid, almost military, despite his age, and his eyes, a sharp steel gray, scanned the horizon with a vigilance that seemed out of place for someone his age. His name was Jack Reynolds, and to the casual observer, he was nothing more than a harmless old man. White hair curled at the edges of his ears, and deep lines etched his sunburned face. A map of years lived hard and honest. Yet, despite his seemingly ordinary presence, there was something magnetic about him. The children would often gather around his bench as he spoke softly about the sea, about distant lands, and about adventures that seemed too incredible to be true. Once my team and I had to cross a river in complete darkness, Jack would begin, his voice low but firm. The only sounds were the water and our heartbeat. One wrong move, and it could have been the end. The children gasped, hanging on every word, imagining the danger, the adventure, and the courage of men who could survive in conditions far beyond their comprehension. But the adults, when they overheard him, tended to roll their eyes. To them, Jack was simply spinning tall tales, entertaining children while feeding his own nostalgia for days long gone. But that afternoon, Jack's quiet storytelling would lead to something entirely unexpected. Officer Daniel Hayes, a young and by-the-book member of the local police department, had been on routine patrol when he noticed the gathering crowd of children. At first, he assumed it was merely a harmless group around a storyteller. But then, he heard Jack mention something that made his ears perk up. "I was a SEAL," Jack said casually, "and my team, Ghost Squadron 9, we were deployed on a mission that's still classified to this day. Most people thought we'd been lost forever, but we survived." Daniel froze. He knew that. Claiming to be a Navy SEAL was no small matter. It was a federal offense if the claim was false. SEALs were revered for their courage and secrecy, and impersonating one could lead to serious consequences. At first, Daniel thought, no one could be that audacious. An old man, pretending. Why here? Why now? He approached Jack, trying to maintain professionalism but tinged with suspicion. "Sir," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I need to ask you a few questions about your claims." Jack looked up at him slowly, unbothered. The corners of his mouth lifted into a small, knowing smile. "I'm happy to answer any questions." "You have," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that made children hang on his every word. Daniel motioned to the children to step back, and then asked, "You say you were a Navy SEAL. Can you provide proof of your service?" Jack nodded, slowly lowering his gaze to his cane. "Records are complicated, but everything I've said is true." Daniel's expression hardened. He had dealt with exaggerations before, men who sought admiration through lies, and this seemed no different. "Complicated doesn't cut it," he said. "I have to take you in. You could be impersonating military personnel, which is a serious offense." Before Jack could respond, Daniel gently placed his hand on the old man's arm. Jack didn't resist. There was no struggle, no argument, only a quiet acknowledgement that this moment might have been inevitable. As they walked toward the patrol car, the children watched in stunned silence, their eyes wide with disbelief and a touch of fear. They had never seen their storyteller taken away. The neighbors came out of their houses, murmuring among themselves. Some were angry, thinking the police had gone too far. Others whispered about the strange old man with the steel-gray eyes and the stories that seemed too real to be fiction. No one knew what to make of it, and yet a hush fell over the park. Even the seagulls seemed to pause, circling above as if sensing the tension. Inside the patrol car, Jack sat quietly, hands folded on his lap. Daniel glanced at him repeatedly, expecting to see fear, perhaps anger, but saw only calm. There was a confidence in the old man's demeanor that unnerved the officer. Every movement, every blink, spoke of discipline honed over decades, of experiences Daniel could only imagine. "You know, most men would fight this," Daniel said. Trying to make conversation, most men would argue their way out. Jack's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Most men haven't done what I've done. They don't understand silence or patience." Daniel frowned, unsure whether he was speaking to a wise man or someone entirely unhinged. By the time they reached the station, word had spread. Other officers watched with curiosity, murmuring about the claim. An old man saying he was a SEAL? How could that be real? Jack was led inside and seated in a holding cell. He didn't ask for water or comfort, didn't protest the chair he was given. He merely sat upright, silent. Even in handcuffs, there was a dignity to him, the kind of quiet power that commanded respect without demanding it. As the evening deepened, Daniel returned to his office, pulling up public military records. He typed in Jack Reynolds, expecting to find no matches, just as he had suspected. No SEALs by that name appeared. The evidence seemed damning. Yet as Daniel stared at the screen, he felt a strange hesitation, a nagging doubt. Something about the old man, the way he carried himself, and the strange intensity of his gaze made Daniel pause. Jack sat in the holding cell, watching shadows lengthen and merge in the dim light. He thought of his fallen comrades, of missions erased from history, and of the silence he had carried for decades. He didn't need anyone to believe him. He never had. But he wondered how long it would take before someone realized the truth, before the world remembered Ghost Squadron 9. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of the sea into the station. Jack inhaled it deeply. No one could see him, but he allowed himself a small, private smile. He had been tested before, survived situations others would call impossible. One more test, he thought, one more challenge, would not break him. And so, the old man waited. The world outside was skeptical, impatient, and unknowing. But Jack Reynolds had patience that spanned decades. For him, this was only the beginning. The fluorescent lights in the small interrogation room flickered faintly, casting long, harsh shadows on the gray walls. Jack Reynolds sat quietly on the hard metal chair, his hands folded on the worn wooden table in front of him. Across from him, two investigators, Agent Matthews and Officer Daniels, shuffled papers, their expressions a mix of skepticism and frustration. The hum of the air conditioner filled the silence, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the chair as Jack shifted slightly, his posture still impeccable. "You understand why you're here, Mr. Reynolds?" Matthews began, his tone sharp. "Claiming to be a Navy SEAL is a serious offense. Impersonating military personnel is a federal crime. Can you provide proof of your service?" Jack's gaze met his without hesitation. The eyes, still clear and piercing despite his age, held a quiet confidence that unnerved both men. "I've served," he said simply, his voice steady. "I've done things most people would never understand. The proof. It's complicated, but every word I've said is the truth." Daniels snorted, leaning back in his chair. "Complicated? You mean impossible. You're an old man, telling stories that sound like they're from a movie. Records show no Jack Reynolds in any SEAL roster." Jack didn't flinch. He placed his hands on the table and leaned slightly forward, as though weighing his words carefully. "Records can be erased, falsified, or hidden. Some of the missions my unit undertook were classified beyond normal military secrecy. Some names were intentionally removed from all files." Matthews exchanged a look with Daniels, raising his eyebrows. So you're saying you were part of some top-secret mission that nobody knows about? Yes, Jack said quietly. And if they did, they would have erased every trace. Daniels laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. Come on, old man. You expect us to believe that? That you were part of a ghost unit no one has ever heard of? Jack's expression remained unchanged. Believe what you want. I don't need your approval. I've lived my life without recognition. I won't start now. Matthews leaned in, trying a different approach. Look, we've dealt with a lot of imposters over the years. Most people want glory, medals, attention. You're different. You're calm, almost too calm. That's suspicious. Why are you so composed? Jack's eyes flicked briefly to the ceiling, then back to the agents. Years in combat teach you patience, he said. They teach you that panic and anger get you killed. I've survived because I learned to wait, to observe, and to trust only what is real. What you see here is reality. Daniels let out a short, bitter laugh. You make it sound heroic. Right now, it just looks like delusion. Records show nothing. You have no medals, no citations. You could be lying. Jack's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. If you want proof, he said, his voice soft but firm, you'll need to look deeper than public records. Some things aren't meant to be found online. Matthews leaned back, exasperated. Online? We're talking military databases, Mr. Reynolds, not some obscure forum. Every SEAL has a record. Every unit is documented. If you were in the Navy, in a SEAL squad, you'd be in there. Simple as that. Jack leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping lower. You're looking for my name. That's your mistake. Look for my unit. Look for the mission. Look for the men who were with me. The records may hide my name, but they cannot hide what we did. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of Jack's words. There was a subtle authority in them, a gravitas that made him hesitate. You're very confident for a man with no evidence, he said, a hint of respect creeping into his tone despite himself. Jack didn't answer immediately. He sat back, staring at the agents, his gaze unwavering. After a long moment, he spoke. Confidence comes from survival. I've been where most men would have died. I've endured things that never make the papers. The truth doesn't need proving to those who don't understand it, but it will speak for itself when it's ready. Matthews rubbed his temples, feeling frustrated and powerless. You're not helping yourself, Mr. Reynolds. You could make this easy by giving us something tangible. Jack's smile widened just slightly. And what would that be? A medal you won't give me? A record that doesn't exist? I have no proof that suits your skepticism. What I have is experience, and perhaps one day someone will recognize it. Until then, I wait. Daniels leaned forward, lowering his voice. You know, most old men exaggerate. They try to make their past sound grand. But something about you, it feels different. I can't explain it. It's like you've really been there. Jack's eyes softened, just a fraction, and he nodded slightly. You may be right. You see, I don't tell these stories for recognition. I tell them because someone must remember. Some things are more important than medals or fame. They're about honor, duty, and the men who never returned. Matthews shot Daniels a glance, unsure how to respond. The room felt heavier now, saturated with history, unspoken loss, and unrecognized heroism. Both men had heard stories of SEALs, of classified operations, but never like this, never from someone who spoke with such authority, with such quiet, lived truth. Daniels broke the silence. If what you say is true, why live quietly here in Seabrook? Why tell stories to children in the park instead of telling the world? Jack's gaze drifted toward the window, where the sun now kissed the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Because the world wasn't ready for the truth," he said softly. "And because some truths, if exposed too soon, could endanger lives, my brother's lives even now. So I waited. I survive quietly. I remember. And sometimes I share fragments, hoping someone listens and understands." Matthews pinched the bridge of his nose, feeling both awe and frustration. "You're impossible, you know that?" he said. Jack's lips curved again faintly, the hint of a wry humor in his eyes. "Impossible is relative. To those who survive, the impossible is only another day." The tension in the room shifted subtly. It was no longer a simple interrogation of an alleged fraud. It had become a test of judgment, of perception, and of the willingness to see beyond what appeared on paper. The two investigators exchanged uneasy glances. There was something about Jack Reynolds, something buried beneath years, secrecy and silence, that they could not yet name, but they knew instinctively it was real. As the room grew darker with the setting sun, the hum of the air conditioning, once irritating, now seemed almost protective. Jack sat silently, eyes steady, waiting for someone who could see through the deception of records, the false narratives, and the skepticism, waiting for recognition of a truth that had been hidden for decades. And somewhere deep inside, both investigators realized, whether they admitted it or not, that this was no ordinary old man sitting before them. This was someone who had lived through extraordinary circumstances. Someone whose story, if they could only uncover it, might change everything they thought they knew about courage, loyalty, and the price of service. Jack Reynolds leaned back, closing his eyes for a brief moment, a small, private smile touching his lips. He had survived worse interrogations, worse dangers. He had endured what most men could not even imagine. And he would endure this too, because the truth, in its own time, always reveals itself. And the truth about Jack Reynolds was far greater than anyone in that small, stark room could yet comprehend. The fluorescent glare of the interrogation room could not dim the intensity of Jack Reynolds' presence. He sat silently, his gray eyes scanning the walls as though searching for ghosts of the past. Outside the small station, the sounds of the town were muted, but inside, a storm was brewing, one that Jack had anticipated for decades in his quiet, patient way. The door opened, and a tall man with a commanding posture stepped inside. His hair was streaked with gray, his uniform crisply adorned with medals and insignia, though faded from years of service. Vice Admiral Arthur Hayes, now retired but still a towering presence, had been following the reports of the SEAL impersonator with a mixture of skepticism and intrigue. Something about the story gnawed at him. He remembered operations that were supposed to be erased, names of men who were never meant to be remembered, missions that existed only in the shadows. He approached the table, eyes narrowing slightly as he took in Jack. For a moment, there was silence, a recognition that transcended years, documentation, and skepticism. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in on the two men who shared a history no one else could see. "Mr. Reynolds," Hayes said carefully, his voice measured, "I've read your file." Jack looked up, his expression unreadable. "Your file, Vice Admiral?" Hayes took a step closer, his gaze fixed on the man before him. "The one that doesn't officially exist. Ghost Squadron 9, Vietnam, 72. My men thought you were lost. I thought you were dead." Jack's eyes flickered, a shadow of old pain crossing his features. "You believed I was gone?" he asked softly. "You thought my story ended in a ditch somewhere in Laos?" Hayes nodded, the weight of memory heavy in his chest. "I had no reason not to. The mission was classified beyond comprehension. We never expected anyone to survive." Jack leaned back slightly, the faintest smile touching his lips. Survival has its ways, he said. Not every battle ends where people expect it to. Matthews and Daniels, standing on either side of the room, exchanged bewildered glances. Their skepticism clashed violently with the aura of history and authority emanating from the two men. The tension in the room was electric. One was a legend thought lost to time, the other a retired vice admiral who had seen ghosts of the past linger too long in memory. Hayes studied Jack carefully, noting the posture, the calm composure, the subtle strength in his hands and shoulders. "I've seen many men over my career," he said quietly. "Few carry themselves like this. There's a weight in your presence that doesn't lie, Mr. Reynolds. And yet, your records say nothing." Jack's gaze softened, but his voice remained firm. "Records can be misleading. They're made for people who follow rules, not for those who survive beyond them. I am proof of things that never made it to paper." Hayes nodded, a shadow of understanding passing over his features. "I remember the day your team vanished," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The mission was compromised. Intelligence went dark. We thought you were casualties. We thought the world had lost Ghost Squadron 9 forever." Jack's eyes glistened slightly, not with fear or anger, but with decades of grief and the burden of silence. "We survived, Vice Admiral," he said. "Some of us did. But the cost was high. And the price of speaking, sometimes too great." Matthews cleared his throat, feeling like an intruder in this unspoken reunion. "Sir, pardon me," he began cautiously, "but how is any of this possible? How could someone survive a mission erased from history?" Hayes turned to Matthews, his eyes narrowing slightly, the faintest glint of warning in his gaze. "Some things aren't meant to be understood by those who weren't there. Some men carry truths that official records cannot hold. Trust me, Mr. Matthews, what you see here is real. This man is Ghost Squadron 9. He is one of us." Daniels shifted uncomfortably, swallowing hard. The reality of the situation began to pierce through the veil of skepticism. Here was a man older than many of them could imagine, calm under pressure, carrying the presence of someone who had stared death in the face countless times and survived. The details of the interrogation seemed trivial now, eclipsed by the weight of history. Hayes leaned forward slightly, studying Jack's forearm. His eyes caught a faint inked mark, barely visible in the dim light. A tattoo that immediately commanded recognition. It was the insignia of Ghost Squadron 9, a symbol that had not been seen officially for decades. Hayes's breath caught. Jack noticed his gaze lingering. "It's been a long time," he said softly. "Faded with years and salt water, but it's still me." Hayes's hand moved almost unconsciously toward the table, as if to confirm what he already knew. "I remember," he whispered, almost to himself. "Every man who bore that mark. Every mission, every brother." Jack inclined his head slightly. "They're not forgotten, Vice Admiral. I never let them be. That is why I speak quietly to those who will listen. That is why I remain here, to survive, to remember, to honor them." The room fell silent. The investigators felt the gravity of the moment pressing down on them. Their questions now seemed insignificant, petty even, compared to the living history in the room. Matthews, who had been so certain of Jack's deception, suddenly felt the weight of doubt and awe. Daniels, too, realized that the old man they had arrested might carry a story far beyond comprehension. Hayes leaned back, his eyes never leaving Jack. "I cannot explain everything yet," he said carefully, "but I know this. You are no imposter. You are a survivor, a witness to what most men cannot even imagine. And history, long buried, owes you the truth." Jack's gaze softened further, the faintest glimmer of relief in his eyes. "I have waited decades for someone to see it. Not for fame, not for glory, just to see that what we did is remembered." Hayes nodded. Then we will see it remembered. You won't be alone in this anymore. Matthews and Daniels exchanged looks of astonishment. Their understanding of reality had shifted in mere moments. The skepticism that had driven their investigation was now tempered by an undeniable truth. The man they had thought was an old fraud was not only real but extraordinary. Jack leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. The weight of decades of silence, of carrying the memory of men lost and missions erased, felt slightly lighter. For the first time in decades, someone who could see, understand, and honor his truth stood before him. The Vice Admiral's recognition had begun a chain reaction, one that would bring long-buried history back to life and challenge everyone who thought they understood courage, loyalty, and the invisible bonds of those who fight in shadows. Outside the small interrogation room, the town continued its quiet evening, unaware that history had just walked through the door, disguised as an old man and quietly bearing the weight of secrets too long forgotten. Jack Reynolds opened his eyes, meeting Hayes's gaze once more. In that silent exchange, decades of pain, loss, and heroism passed between them. And for the first time, Jack knew that someone understood. The small interrogation room seemed suddenly smaller, charged with a tension neither Jack Reynolds nor Vice Admiral Arthur Hayes had spoken aloud. The investigators, Matthews and Daniels, were still reeling from the quiet authority and gravitas of Jack's presence. Their skepticism had begun to crumble, but nothing could have prepared them for the discovery Hayes was about to make. Hayes leaned slightly closer to the old man, his eyes tracing the faded lines of Jack's forearm. There it was, a mark. So subtle, yet so unmistakable, that Hayes felt a jolt of recognition ripple through his chest. The tattoo, a ghostly emblem etched decades ago, bore the insignia of Ghost Squadron 9. Only the men of that unit had been allowed to bear it, and it had been strictly forbidden for anyone else to wear it. Matthews and Daniels noticed the Vice Admiral's sudden stillness. His gaze had sharpened, his breathing slightly uneven. "What is it?" Daniels whispered, unable to contain his curiosity. Hayes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied the intricate design, tracing the faded lines with his eyes. The tattoo was more than ink. It was history. It was sacrifice. It was proof of a life lived in the shadows of secrecy and survival. Hayes's mind raced, recalling the covert operations of Ghost Squadron 9, the mission that had been erased. From official records, the men who were presumed dead, and the young Jack Reynolds who had walked into history and vanished. "This," Hayes said finally, his voice low and reverent, "is the insignia of Ghost Squadron 9. Jack inclined his arm slightly, letting the tattoo catch the light from the overhead fluorescent bulb. "It has faded with time," he said softly, "but it's still mine. And so are the memories it carries." The investigators exchanged uneasy glances. The idea that this frail, elderly man could carry the mark of a SEAL, a warrior of the deadliest, most secretive unit in the Navy, seemed impossible. Yet, the authority in Hayes's voice, the recognition in his eyes, and the calm, unyielding composure of Jack made it undeniable. Matthews took a cautious step forward. "Sir, you're saying he's a real SEAL?" Hayes exhaled slowly, the weight of decades pressing down on him. "More than that," he said. "He is one of the few men who survived a mission erased from history. Ghost Squadron 9, the mission that disappeared without a trace, the men who were never spoken of. He is one of them." Jack's expression remained calm, but a subtle emotion flickered across his features. Relief. For years, he had carried the burden of survival alone, his story unrecognized, his deeds unrecorded. And now, in this dimly lit room, with the Vice Admiral standing beside him and two young investigators witnessing it, the truth was finally being seen. Daniels shook his head, trying to process it. I don't understand. How can this be real? Records say nothing. Every SEAL roster, every mission log. Empty. How does a man survive something like that and leave no trace? Jack's gaze softened, almost mournful. Because we were ordered to vanish. Because the mission was too sensitive. Because our survival was not meant to be celebrated. It was meant to be a secret. And I obeyed, as we all did. Hayes's eyes darkened as he recalled the missions, the firefights in the dense jungles of Vietnam, the ambushes, and the moments where every man thought he might die. He remembered the young, brash men of Ghost. Squadron 9 who had sworn loyalty to each other, a bond unbreakable even in the face of death. I thought you were lost, he murmured, almost to himself. Jack nodded slightly. And I thought I would remain lost too. For decades, I have carried their memory in silence. I have told fragments of the truth to those who would listen. Little by little, never revealing names, never giving proof, but keeping them alive in memory. Matthews finally spoke, his voice tinged with awe. So, all this time, we arrested a man for telling the truth? Jack's lips curved faintly, almost humorously. It appears so. But understand, I never lied. I merely survived. That is enough for some, and for others, it is a lifetime of disbelief. Hayes leaned closer to Jack, lowering his voice. You've kept the secret for 50 years, he said. Why now? Why speak at all? Jack's eyes met Hayes's, holding a depth that words could not capture. Because time has passed, he said quietly. Because the men who are with me deserve to be remembered. Because some stories, though erased, demand witnesses. And because the world sometimes forgets those who serve in silence. Daniel swallowed hard. He could feel the history pressing in around him, the weight of unspoken heroism. I don't know what to say, he admitted, almost whispering. You don't need to say anything, Jack replied. Recognition is not my purpose. Survival and memory are my purpose. And now, perhaps, someone else will carry that memory with respect. Hayes nodded, his eyes lingering on the tattoo once more. This insignia, he said, represents courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. It is proof not only of your service, but of the men you carried with you, and the ones we thought we lost forever. Jack's gaze softened, the faintest trace of emotion flickering across his weathered face. For decades, he had been invisible, a ghost among ghosts. Now, in this small, stark room, the proof of his identity was visible to the one man who mattered most, Vice Admiral Arthur Hayes, who had shared the horrors and sacrifices of that forgotten mission. Matthews and Daniels watched in silence, their skepticism shattered. They had come to the interrogation, expecting a fraud, a man spinning tales for attention or sympathy. Instead, they faced a living legend, a survivor whose very presence carried decades of untold history. The young officers realized, with a mix of awe and unease, that they were witnesses to something far larger than any ordinary investigation. Jack leaned back slightly, letting the weight of recognition settle over him. The years of silence, of hiding, of carrying memory alone, seemed lighter now. Finally, someone knew. Finally, someone understood. Hayes exhaled deeply, his voice quiet but firm. We will honor them, he said. We will see that history remembers. Ghost Squadron 9, your brothers, and you, no longer hidden in the shadows. Jack nodded, the faintest smile appearing on his lips. Then my duty continues. Not for medals, not for fame, but for the men who cannot speak for themselves. For their memory. And for truth, however long it takes to be recognized. Matthews glanced at Daniels, speechless. The interrogation had transformed into a revelation. What began as suspicion had become reverence. What was once a crime now stood as history, finally seen, finally honored. Outside, the town of Seabrook continued its evening hum, unaware that in a small room in the police station, decades of secrecy, sacrifice, and survival had been quietly unveiled. Inside, Jack Reynolds, an old man with a tattoo faded by time, sat recognized for the first time as what he truly was, a living testament to courage, loyalty, and the invisible bonds of warriors who survive against all odds. And as Hayes's eyes lingered on the tattoo, the old man finally allowed himself a sense of quiet relief. The truth had been spotted. The world's misunderstanding was beginning to unravel. And for the first time in decades, Jack Reynolds felt that perhaps the past, long buried, might finally be seen in the light it deserved. The room had grown quieter than ever. Even the humming of the air conditioning seemed distant, swallowed by the weight of history settling over the four men in the interrogation room. Jack Reynolds leaned back slightly in his chair, his weathered hands folded over one another on the table. The tattoo on his forearm, the insignia of Ghost Squadron 9, glimmered faintly in the harsh overhead light. For the first time, he felt that the burden of decades of silence might be lifted, if only slightly. Vice Admiral Arthur Hayes, his tall frame still radiating authority, even in civilian clothes, moved closer. He lowered his voice to a near whisper, speaking to Jack alone. "Tell me everything you can," he said. "Only what you are willing to share. No one else needs to know yet." Jack's eyes, gray as storm clouds, softened. He nodded slowly, taking a deep breath before speaking. "It begins in 1972, he said, his voice low and steady. Ghost Squadron 9 was deployed on a mission that few even knew existed. We were tasked with entering enemy territory to gather intelligence and neutralize threats that could not be exposed to the public or even to the Pentagon. It was dangerous work, the kind of mission where survival was never guaranteed." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Matthews and Daniels exchanged glances, unsure whether they should interject, yet too captivated to look away. Hayes, however, remained silent, letting Jack speak, knowing that the details were fragments of a truth long buried and almost impossible to comprehend. "We crossed rivers in the dead of night," Jack continued, his voice calm but carrying the weight of memory. "We moved through jungles where every shadow could conceal death. We watched comrades fall, and sometimes we couldn't retrieve them. Orders were strict. No one could know our movements, and no one could leave any evidence behind. It was a life suspended between existence and oblivion." Jack's hands tightened slightly around his own fingers, as if holding on to something invisible. "My team, my brothers, were everything to me. We trained together, fought together, and we trusted each other with our lives. When the mission went wrong, the intelligence compromised. We were presumed dead. I survived." Hayes's jaw tightened, memories rushing back of the men he had lost, names he had whispered in the dark, lives erased from official history. "You were the only one unaccounted for," he said softly, almost to himself. Jack nodded. "I was tasked with survival above all else. To return if possible, unseen. To carry the memory of my brothers forward in silence. Every day since, I have lived with the knowledge that I was expected to vanish, that my survival might be a threat to others if exposed." The room was heavy with silence. Matthews and Daniels felt as if they were intruding on a sacred moment, a confession that transcended any law or investigation. Jack's story was not merely about survival. It was about loyalty, sacrifice, and the invisible bonds forged in the crucible of war. "I could not speak," Jack continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. "The cost of revealing our existence was too high. Lives could be endangered. Families could be destroyed. And yet, I lived. I watched the world move on, thinking I was gone. Thinking Ghost Squadron 9 was a ghost story to scare new recruits." Hayes reached out. placing a steady hand over Jack's. And you carried the burden alone. All these years. Jack's eyes glistened, though he blinked quickly, unwilling to show too much emotion. I have told stories, he said, fragments. Stories to children, to friends, to anyone who might remember, even slightly, what it means to survive and honor those who cannot speak for themselves. I never sought recognition, medals, or fame. I only sought to carry their memory, to survive in a way that ensured their sacrifices were not forgotten entirely. Matthews broke the silence hesitantly. And the mission? The men you lost? Were they really gone? Jack's voice grew heavy with grief. Every one of them. We were the best trained, the most loyal, but even loyalty cannot stop a bullet or a misstep in enemy territory. I buried them in my mind. I honor them in silence, every day. And the world doesn't know, and they never will, unless someone chooses to remember. Daniel swallowed hard, feeling a tightness in his chest. I don't know what to say, he admitted. It's unimaginable. Jack leaned forward, his eyes locking with Daniel's. You don't need to say anything. You only need to understand that some truths live beyond recognition. Some men carry stories that cannot be written in history books. And some heroes survive only to remember. Hayes exhaled slowly, the lines on his face deepening. You've carried the memory of these men for 50 years, he said softly. And now, the world finally knows, at least partially, that you exist. That you lived, that you survived. That Ghost Squadron 9 is not just a name lost to history. Jack nodded slightly, a faint smile appearing on his face. I have waited for recognition in my own way. Not for glory, but for someone to see, to understand. That is enough. And perhaps, now, it will be more than enough. The weight in the room was palpable. For decades, Jack had carried the secrets of his fallen brothers, the erased missions, and the invisible scars of survival. For the first time, in the presence of a man who had shared those horrors and two witnesses to the outside world, Jack allowed himself a small release of the tension that had gripped him for half a century. He spoke again, softer this time, almost a murmur. I have survived, yes, but I have also remembered. Every day, every hour, I have remembered. And that memory is my purpose. Hayes leaned back, looking at Jack with a mixture of respect, sorrow, and admiration. You are extraordinary, he said. Not for surviving alone, but for surviving with honor, for carrying the memory of your brothers without complaint, without recognition. That is true heroism, Jack. That is what history should have remembered. Jack's gaze softened, and for a moment, he allowed a vulnerability few had ever seen. I don't need medals, he said. I don't need the public to know. I only needed someone who could understand. And now, Vice Admiral, you do. And perhaps, finally, some of the world will follow suit. Matthews and Daniels remained silent, overwhelmed by the enormity of what they had just witnessed. The story of Jack Reynolds was not a tale of exaggeration or deceit. It was a chronicle of courage, sacrifice, and loyalty beyond comprehension. The room, once a place of accusation and skepticism, had transformed into a sanctuary of truth and recognition. Jack leaned back, closing his eyes for a brief moment, letting the memories wash over him. The camaraderie, the loss, the missions erased from history, and the decades of silent survival. For the first time in 50 years, he felt a sense of relief, not from recognition or fame, but from the acknowledgement that his truth had been seen and understood. Hayes watched him, silently honoring the man who had carried so much for so long. We will honor them, Hayes said quietly. We will see that history finally remembers Ghost Squadron 9. Your brothers will not be forgotten, and neither will you. Jack opened his eyes, a faint glimmer of gratitude in them. That is enough, he said softly. That is more than enough. The investigators, too, were changed. They had arrived expecting to confront a fraud, a man embellishing tales to entertain children or gain attention. Instead, they had witnessed a living legend, a survivor whose life and memory carried the weight of unspeakable history. They understood, finally, that Jack Reynolds was more than a man. He was a vessel of truth, honor, and memory, a man who had lived the impossible and carried it silently for half a century. Outside, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a deep twilight over Seabrook. Inside the room, history had come alive. And for Jack Reynolds, the burden of decades of silence felt just a little lighter. For the first time in 50 years, he felt seen. The following morning, the small police station buzzed with unusual energy. Jack Reynolds sat quietly in the corner of the interrogation room, his hands resting lightly on his cane, eyes closed in contemplation. He barely noticed the stir around him. For decades, he had endured scrutiny far harsher than mere questions. The world had doubted him, misjudged him, even accused him of lying, yet he remained unshaken. He had long accepted that recognition would be slow, if it came at all. Outside the room, Vice Admiral Arthur Hayes and the investigators Matthews and Daniels huddled around a computer terminal. Hayes' eyes, sharp and unwavering, scanned through lines of encrypted data, cross-referencing long-forgotten archives from the Department of Defense. Matthews tapped nervously on the desk, the skepticism of yesterday now replaced with awe and apprehension. Daniels, normally outspoken, remained silent, sensing the gravity of the moment. Hayes' fingers hovered over the keyboard as he typed in Jack Reynolds' name, expecting little more than empty files and erased histories. Yet as the search progressed, anomalies began to appear, encrypted documents marked as top secret that referenced Ghost Squadron 9. Every line seemed to echo Jack's words from the previous day. A covert unit deployed on missions that had been deliberately wiped from official rosters. The files mentioned dates, locations, and personnel movements, every detail matching Jack's account. Daniels leaned in closer, disbelief etched across his face. This can't be real, he whispered. These files, they confirm everything he said. Every mission, every operation, it's all here. Matthews, equally stunned, shook his head. But how? He was supposed to be erased from history. Nothing in the public or classified databases should even exist. This is incredible. Hayes didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the screen, moving methodically through document after document. Each file reinforced what Jack had confessed. Ghost Squadron 9 had existed. Jack Reynolds had survived missions that official history had claimed were fatal. The men he had called brothers were documented as missing in action, their fates sealed under layers of secrecy. But here, hidden in encrypted archives, their truth remained intact. Hayes finally turned to the investigators, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "You see now," he said. "This man is no fraud. Every detail he gave matches these records. He was part of a unit thought lost to history. Ghost Squadron 9 wasn't a myth. It was real, and he survived when almost no one thought it possible." Daniels ran a hand through his hair, trying to absorb the enormity of what he was witnessing. "We arrested him. For telling the truth?" he asked, incredulity coloring every word. "For decades, he carried this history, and we doubted him?" Matthews remained silent, his mind racing. He had spent years learning to trust evidence and documents. Yet here was a man whose life story had transcended ordinary verification. The old, frail figure sitting just a few feet away had become more than a legend. He was a living archive of courage, survival, and unspoken heroism. Hayes pointed to a line in the database that caught his attention, the mission details. "Look here," he said. The files describe a covert insertion into enemy territory, exactly as he said. A unit was presumed dead after enemy ambushes. Yet some members, including Reynolds, survived and were extracted later, under the radar of public knowledge. Jack opened his eyes at the mention of the mission, his gaze calm but unwavering. "They wanted to erase us," he said quietly. "To the world, we never existed. To survive, I had to vanish completely, leave no trace. That is why I remained silent. And now, I see someone is finally seeing." Matthews, still struggling to process, asked, "But the other men? Are they documented too?" Hayes nodded solemnly. "Yes, some were confirmed dead, others captured. Some went missing in action and were never officially recovered. The files detail the names of the men who were with him, men he honored silently for decades." Daniels felt a lump form in his throat. So every story, every memory he carried, it's all true. All of it. Jack leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. "Truth is not always in records," he said softly. "Sometimes it lives in memory, in the bond between men who have seen the edge of death together. That bond is what I have carried for 50 years. Hayes allowed a faint, rare smile. "And now we can begin to correct what history forgot. The records confirm your survival, your courage, and the truth of Ghost Squadron 9. You are no longer invisible, Jack. Your deeds will be acknowledged." Jack's gaze softened, but he remained composed. "Recognition is not why I speak. My brothers, my unit, they deserve remembrance. If I am recognized, it is only for them, not for me." Matthews and Daniels looked at each other, finally grasping the magnitude of what they had uncovered. The investigation that had begun as an attempt to uncover a fraud had instead revealed a living legend. A man whose life had defied death, erased history, and carried the memory of lost comrades with unparalleled loyalty and humility. Hayes closed the files and leaned back. "It is time to honor them properly," he said. "Not just in secret, but where history will remember. This will require careful planning, discretion, and respect for those who remain classified. But the truth is now undeniable." Jack nodded slightly, a faint relief in his expression. For decades, he had endured the weight of silence, carrying memories that could never be shared without consequence. Now, with the confirmation of records and the understanding of a vice admiral who had known the horrors firsthand, the invisible burden began to lift. Daniels, almost in awe, whispered, I never thought I'd see something like this. Arresting him. It feels like a crime in itself." Jack's lips curved faintly, a wry humor in his eyes. "Sometimes the world judges by appearances, not by truth. That is a lesson I have learned long ago. But let it be known now, the men of Ghost Squadron 9 lived. Their mission, their loyalty, and their sacrifice will not be forgotten." Hayes placed a steady hand on Jack's shoulder. "And we will ensure that they are remembered," he said firmly. "Their names, their deeds, and your survival, history will finally record it accurately." Outside the station, Seabrook continued its quiet routine, unaware that the course of history had just shifted. Within the small walls of the interrogation room, decades of secrecy, heroism, and silent survival had been verified. Jack Reynolds, the old man once arrested for pretending to be a SEAL, was now fully recognized as a survivor, a hero, and a living testament to the truth of Ghost Squadron 9. Jack leaned back, closing his eyes briefly, feeling a sense of vindication and relief that had been decades in the making. For the first time in half a century, he allowed himself a deep breath, knowing that the truth he had carried alone for so long had finally been confirmed. The silent soldiers he had honored privately could now, at last, be remembered. And for the investigators who had doubted him, for the Vice Admiral who had long awaited this moment, and for Jack himself, History had begun to recognize what had long been invisible: the courage, sacrifice, and enduring legacy of Ghost Squadron 9. The morning sun bathed the small coastal town of Seabrook in gold, casting long shadows across the newly erected stage in the town square. Flags fluttered in the crisp breeze, and a crowd had gathered that seemed unusually large for a town known for its quiet streets. The residents whispered among themselves, curious about the event, unaware of the extraordinary story about to unfold. Jack Reynolds arrived quietly, leaning on his cane, his posture still upright, his gray eyes reflecting a mixture of calm and unspoken anticipation. Behind him, Vice Admiral Arthur Hayes walked with a steady, commanding presence, his uniform crisp in metals, glinting faintly in the morning light. The two investigators, Matthews and Daniels, had been invited to witness history as well, now feeling both pride and awe at their earlier misunderstanding. The ceremony began with a somber note. Hayes approached the podium, clearing his throat before addressing the crowd. "Today," he said, his voice firm but reverent, "we honor a man whose life exemplifies courage, sacrifice, and unwavering loyalty. A man who, for decades, carried the memory of his fallen comrades, serving in silence and preserving the legacy of Ghost Squadron 9. Jack's hands remained steady on his cane. He did not speak. The Vice Admiral's words were enough. Yet, as the crowd turned to glance at him, murmurs rippled through the audience. Some faces showed confusion, others awe, and many reflected a newfound respect. Here was an elderly man who, to most, had seemed ordinary, yet he carried the weight of history itself. Hayes continued, recounting the story in measured detail. In 1972, a covert unit known as Ghost Squadron 9 was deployed on a mission deemed so dangerous and sensitive that its very existence was classified. The unit faced insurmountable odds, traversing enemy territory under constant threat, and was presumed lost. Yet one man survived. Jack Reynolds survived, carrying the memory of his brothers and the truth of the mission through decades of silence. The crowd grew silent, listening intently as Hayes detailed the bravery and sacrifice of the men Jack had served with. Children's eyes widened, and adults felt a stirring they could not articulate. The ordinary man sitting quietly before them was anything but ordinary. Hayes paused, then gestured toward Jack. "Jack Reynolds, today we honor you not for fame, not for medals, but for your courage, your loyalty, and your unwavering commitment to your comrades. You are a living testament to heroism that defies recognition. And today, finally, the world sees your truth." Jack slowly stood, leaning on his cane, his hands gripping it with quiet strength. His gray eyes scanned the crowd, taking in the faces of those who had come to witness history. He remained composed, yet there was a subtle tremor in his expression, not fear, but the weight of decades finally being acknowledged. A hush fell over the audience as Hayes retrieved a small worn case from the podium. He opened it carefully, revealing a silver medal engraved with the emblem of Ghost Squadron 9. The crowd gasped softly. Jack's lips twitched into a faint, almost shy smile. "By the authority of the United States Navy and the Department of Defense," Hayes said, his voice resonating across the square, "we present this medal to Jack Reynolds, in recognition of his extraordinary service, survival, and enduring legacy as a member of Ghost Squadron 9. Jack took the medal in his hands, feeling the cold metal against his skin. It was more than a token. It was validation, acknowledgement, and remembrance, a symbol of every sacrifice he had carried silently for decades. He lifted it gently, the crowd erupting in applause, some moved to tears. Matthews and Daniels watched in awe, feeling the weight of history as it unfolded before them. Their skepticism had been replaced by profound respect. They had gone from doubting Jack's truth to witnessing the culmination of decades-long service finally being honored. Hayes stepped aside, allowing Jack to address the crowd, though he spoke softly. "I do not speak for myself," Jack began, his voice calm but resonant. "I speak for the men of Ghost Squadron 9 who are no longer with us. Their bravery, their sacrifice, and their loyalty deserve remembrance far beyond what any medal or ceremony can convey. I have carried their memory for 50 years, and today you honor them as much as me." The crowd listened in stunned silence, the weight of his words sinking deeply. People felt the magnitude of the story. A man who had endured loss, secrecy, and danger, yet had never sought glory, only survival and remembrance for his comrades. Children listened with wide eyes, understanding the gravity even if they could not comprehend it fully. Jack continued, his gaze steady. "I survived because of my brothers. And now, finally, the world sees them through me. Let this be a reminder that courage does not always demand recognition, and heroism does not always appear in records. Sometimes it lives quietly, in memory, until someone chooses to honor it." Hayes nodded, pride evident in his expression. "Jack Reynolds, you embody the values of courage, loyalty, and integrity. Your story will now be preserved, and your comrades remembered. The nation owes you a debt that can never be repaid, and today we begin to acknowledge it." The crowd erupted in applause again, louder and more heartfelt than before. Tears streaked down the faces of veterans and civilians alike. Some could hardly believe that they were witnessing a living legend, someone who had been presumed lost to history, finally receiving the recognition he had long deserved. Jack lowered his gaze, the applause washing over him. For decades, he had endured disbelief, suspicion, and erasure. And yet, this moment was more than personal recognition. It was a restoration of memory, a vindication for men who had been sacrificed to secrecy, and a testament to the enduring bonds of those who serve in silence. As the ceremony concluded, Hayes helped Jack step down from the stage, guiding him carefully. "Your story will be remembered," Hayes said quietly. "Not just today, but in history books, in archives, and in the hearts of those who understand sacrifice." Jack nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "That is all I have ever wanted," he said softly. "To survive, to remember, and to ensure that the men who could not speak for themselves are not forgotten." The crowd began to disperse slowly, still murmuring in awe about the extraordinary life they had just witnessed. But Jack Reynolds remained at the center, a quiet figure of dignity and strength, having finally received the acknowledgement he had earned, not for fame or glory, but for truth, courage, and loyalty. Matthews and Daniels followed behind, both shaken and inspired. They had been part of an investigation that transformed into a living history lesson, one that would stay with them forever. They realized that Jack's story transcended law, records, and skepticism. It was a chronicle of human endurance, sacrifice, and integrity that demanded respect and remembrance. As the sun rose higher over Seabrook, Jack Reynolds looked out at the horizon, the gentle waves reflecting the morning light. The past 50 years of silence, survival, and memory now had a voice. The world had finally recognized Ghost Squadron 9, and he had survived not only the mission, but the erasure of history itself. And for the first time in decades, Jack felt a quiet, profound peace. The days following the ceremony in Seabrook were quiet, but they carried an unspoken resonance. Jack Reynolds returned to his modest home near the coastline, the scent of salt water drifting through open windows. The town had slowly begun to recognize him, not just as an elderly man with a remarkable story, but as a living link to a past of courage and sacrifice that had long been invisible to the world. Inside, Jack sat in his favorite chair, the sunlight spilling over the worn leather. The medal from Ghost Squadron 9 lay on the table beside him, polished and gleaming, yet secondary to the intangible weight of memory it represented. The true honor was never in the medal. he thought, but in the acknowledgement that the lives of his brothers, his comrades lost to time and secrecy, would finally be remembered. He opened a small weathered journal he had kept over the decades, filled with fragments of memories, sketches, and notes about operations, some mundane, some perilous. Every page held the echo of a man's loyalty, the grief of unspoken loss, and the quiet triumph of survival. These were his companions when the world seemed indifferent. Now, perhaps, they would serve a new purpose, as a record that could educate, inspire, and memorialize those who had been denied official recognition. Matthews and Daniels visited the following morning, their expressions a mixture of reverence and curiosity. "I still can't believe we doubted you," Daniels said quietly, almost ashamed. "After everything we've learned? It feels like we were blind." Jack smiled faintly, a gentle warmth in his eyes. "Skepticism is natural," he said. "People want proof. They want certainty. I lived in a world where certainty could be lethal, where being seen could cost lives. All I've ever asked is for understanding, not blind faith." Matthews nodded, still trying to process the enormity of it. "The records, the medal, it's incredible. But it's more than that. What you've survived, what you've carried. It's beyond belief. You've preserved history by living it." Jack leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. History is preserved not by those who survive, but by those who remember. The men of Ghost Squadron 9 did not exist on paper, but they existed in each other's actions, courage, and loyalty. I have remembered them every day. That memory is my legacy. Daniels, clearly moved, asked, "Do you ever regret staying silent? Not telling anyone sooner?" Jack shook his head slowly. "Regret is for those who acted without purpose. My silence protected lives, honored the fallen, and preserved the integrity of our mission. Sometimes survival requires invisibility. That was the choice I had to make. I do not regret it. I only mourn what was lost." The conversation shifted, naturally, to the men he had served with. Jack spoke quietly, sharing glimpses of their courage, their quirks, and the unbreakable bonds they had formed in the jungles of Vietnam. Each story was a tribute, each memory a resurrection of those who could no longer speak for themselves. Matthews and Daniels listened, captivated by the depth of humanity in Jack's recollections. "Every mission," Jack said, "was a test of loyalty, courage, and endurance. We were pushed to the limits of survival, yet we looked out for each other. And when we lost some, I carried them with me. I had no choice but to honor them in silence, because to speak could have cost lives. Now, at last, some of that silence can be lifted." Over the next few weeks, Jack began corresponding with veterans organizations, historians, and even local schools. His story, once hidden in shadows, began to reach wider audiences. Letters arrived from people inspired by his life, recognizing the heroism in ordinary perseverance, and reflecting on the invisible sacrifices made by those who serve quietly. Jack replied to each letter personally, his handwriting careful, thoughtful, conveying not pride, but a deep sense of responsibility. One afternoon, Hayes visited Jack at his home. He brought photographs of Ghost Squadron 9, taken decades earlier, and laid them on the table. "I want to make sure the men are remembered," Hayes said quietly. "Their names, their faces, the truth of their service." Jack's eyes lingered on the photographs. The faces of young men, full of life, courage, and resolve, stared back at him. He traced the images with his fingers, remembering their laughter, their determination, their moments of fear, and the ultimate sacrifice some had made. "They deserve more than a story," Jack said softly. "They deserve recognition, honor, and remembrance. Every day that passes without that is a day they remain invisible." Hayes nodded solemnly. "And we will ensure they are remembered. You've given us the truth, and now the world will know." Ghost Squadron 9 will live in history, as it should, not as a myth, but as men who were brave beyond measure. Jack leaned back, feeling a rare sense of closure. He thought of the countless nights alone, the memories he had carried like weights in his chest, and the decades of silence that had defined his life. Now, for the first time in 50 years, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The past was acknowledged, his brothers remembered, and his survival had meaning beyond mere existence. Later that evening, Jack walked along the coastline near his home. The waves lapped gently against the shore, and the wind carried a familiar salt scent. He paused, looking out over the horizon, thinking of the men who had not survived, of the missions erased, and of the sacrifices that had shaped his life. "They are not forgotten," he murmured quietly. "They live in memory, in honor, and in those who choose to remember. And that is enough." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the water. Jack felt a profound peace settle over him, not from recognition, medals, or ceremonies, but from knowing that the truth had finally been seen, that his story and the story of Ghost Squadron 9 would endure. In the weeks that followed, the town of Seabrook embraced Jack as more than a survivor. They honored him as a living testament to courage, sacrifice, and resilience. Children learned his story in school. Local newspapers featured articles. Historians documented the newly declassified accounts of Ghost Squadron 9. Jack's life, once invisible to history, had become a beacon of remembrance. Matthews and Daniels, transformed by their experience, continued to visit, helping Jack preserve his journals, ensuring that future generations could understand the extraordinary life he had lived. They marveled at his humility, his strength, and his unwavering dedication to honoring the fallen. Jack often reflected on his journey, the narrow escapes, the losses, the decades of secrecy, and the eventual recognition. "Survival alone is not enough," he would tell them quietly. "It is what you do with survival that defines your legacy. And my legacy is them." The old man had walked through life carrying ghosts, memories, and burdens unseen. But at last, he could walk a little lighter, knowing that history had finally acknowledged his truth, and that the men of Ghost Squadron 9, his brothers in arms, would live forever in memory. As night fell over Seabrook, Jack Reynolds sat in his favorite chair, the waves crashing gently in the distance. He allowed himself a quiet smile, the first real smile in decades unburdened by secrecy or the weight of unspoken memory. His journey had been long, harrowing, and lonely. Yet in the end, he had survived, remembered, and honored. And that was more than enough.